And welcome everyone here today. Thank you all for turning up so promptly. And thank you to the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner for organising such a successful 2 days already. I'm not calling it yet, James. You still have the afternoon to muck it up, but so far, so good. So we have a great panel here today, and we're going to get straight into it so that we are going to leave plenty of time for questions. And if there's some of the questions that have followed on from the earlier session you didn't get a chance to ask, you can throw them at these as well. So let me start at the end. We have Poonam Datar, who's a specialist in worker-driven due diligence, and as you would all know, she's the former CEO of the Cleaning Accountability Framework, where she developed the worker-centric certification framework. Then we have Dr. Hannah Thinyane, who's the Director of Supply Chain Technology Research and Development at Diginex, an impact technology company. Then we have Robyn Ormerod, who is with the International Organiser for Migration, the UN Migration Agency, and she's the focal point for modern slavery and counter-trafficking for IOM Australia. And finally, on my right, Jonathan Cook, in case you couldn't identify Jonathan, the only man here, who we've kindly led on the panel, is the National Organiser for the Australian Workers' Union, the AWU, and he's particularly focused on agriculture, horticulture, pastoral, glass and retail industries. So the idea of this session is around sort of centering worker voice, and this is one of the questions that's often thrown at companies, is around, why don't you talk to workers? You know, what are you doing? Why aren't you thinking about that more? And often it's, how do we do it? It might be obvious in your immediate workplace, in your headquarters, but then when you start to look at a supply chain, you know, sometimes it gets more and more difficult around it. So we're going to try to get into, with our sort of round of questions, some of the practical aspects of that. So Poonam, I actually want to start with you on this one, and sort of a double-barreled question. It's around, when we talk about direct worker engagement by companies, what does that actually mean in practice? And a lot of companies do things like social audits. Is it the same thing, or is it something different? And then particularly, can you draw out some of the challenges you see in fostering that type of direct engagement between workers and business in this context of due diligence?
Thank you, Justine. Hi, everyone. So I guess I'd like to approach this question from an industrial relations standpoint. Now, I'm really sorry if this is I'm sort of speaking to you on things you already know. I'm sure there'll be a bit of that today, but stick with me through this. So typically, a company is going to engage directly and regularly with workers as part of the standard workplace relations system. The parties will engage on a multitude of subjects, including wages, health and safety, and performance. The most balanced employer-employee relationship will exist where workers are acting collectively, most likely through their union. As a result, there is open and frequent worker engagement happening, and any potential or actual non-compliance is likely to be identified and can be addressed promptly. So there are three key themes to draw out from this. The first one is that there is a regulatory framework that is guiding worker engagement here. This is important, particularly in relation to industries where you have vulnerable workers, because it affords protection and a set of rules that everyone needs to abide by. Secondly, workers are acting collectively. So this is important, as it's more likely that an individual speaking up will face denial or retribution rather than a group of workers speaking up together. Third, unions have specific powers to undertake compliance activities and are independent. Now, social audits can take a number of forms, but in Australia, they cannot replace the industrial relations framework. Genuine worker engagement requires workers having agency, and most models of social audits that at least I've seen out there place more agency with the company, who are generally the ones that are also funding these audits and paying for these audits. So we've recently had a raft of new legislation go through, a bunch of IR reforms that have taken place, and in conjunction with some of the work that we're doing in this anti-slavery space, as a company, I would probably also be paying a lot of attention to those changes that are going through in any kind of anti-slavery and anti-exploitation effort taking place in the workplace. Second part of the question, which is on challenges, so there's a lot of challenges. What I was referring to earlier refers to the regulated workplace. It doesn't refer to the unregulated informal workplace or informal economy. That's a huge topic all by itself, and we don't really have time to unpack that here, so I'm just going to leave that out there as a major challenge. But one of the other biggest challenges that we have is that there's been a decline in union membership over the last few decades. And effective due diligence requires meaningful worker engagement, which requires building trust with workers. Now, unionised workplaces are safer environments for workers to speak up, and they're more likely to obtain redress for any wrongdoing that's identified. So a lack of unionised workplaces means that you have to create safe spaces, you have to build trust, and you absolutely need to follow through on any issues that have come up. And all of that requires a lot of time and a lot of money. So in my experience with the Cleaning Accountability Framework, but also with other worker-led due diligence mechanisms, I also worked at Ethical Clothing Australia, a lot of businesses are simply not willing to pay for this and are instead looking for cheaper alternatives that rely a little too much on things like worker surveys and worker interviews. And I'll end there.
Great. Well, I think we'll come back to you. So, Jonathan, if I go to you and sort of pick up on some of the points that Poonam talked about, particularly around the role of unions. So, a lot of times we think about, well, what happens when something goes wrong? We file a complaint, we raise a grievance, but that's a huge toll, sort of on the worker and their representatives as well. So, if prevention is better than a cure, have you seen instances where, sort of practical examples, where workers have actually been engaged and consulted before something goes wrong or in the design of a process that you could talk to us about?
Yeah, for sure. And as in my introduction, the industries that I'm really working in currently where this is a active and ongoing problem is agriculture, horticulture and pastoral, and specifically horticulture. And I'm sure lots of people here know that the PALM scheme was brought in the last few years as a way of having a regulated labour stream for horticulture, replacing what was the backpacker scheme, etc., while that still exists, which we know was an unmitigated disaster in the way in which workers were treated, and they had no power in their workplaces to actually not be exploited and put in horrible conditions. So a lot of the work I do is with Pacific Island workers, and it is really difficult. The Pacific is a diverse and different experiences of workers, and they come from different backgrounds with different union experiences, etc. But they're all facing the same problems. They all turn up in Australia not understanding what their rights are, not understanding what a good workplace or a good employer looks like, not understanding how unions are part of, as Poonam says, the framework, and in a lot of cases, not understanding the paperwork that they have to sign. Under the PALM scheme, you must have accommodation, you must have transport, you must have private health insurance all sorted with your employer, and you'll put a form in front of you saying, sign this to work. You want to earn your $28 and $26 an hour, sign this contract. And they sign it, but they don't understand. We would not expect that of any other worker in this country, and that is how it is, that operates every day in the PALM scheme currently, and it's something that we really need to be better on. To the substance of your question about what is working, you look at me, I'm not a Pacific Islander, right? And so when I go out and I talk to these workers and I try to bring out those issues and I try to help them solve those problems, often I just get blank stares. We do regional worker education forums where we go out and we find the workers, and it takes months of finding the leader, finding the community leader, the person who looks like them, speaks their language, and can bring those issues out in a forum much similar to this. Although we would have started with a prayer if the Pacific Islanders were in the room and a song. But those community leaders are the people who can actually get those workers to engage. And so my union, along with the TWU and the SDA, have a retail supply chain alliance where we're trying to organise across the supply chain. And we have MOUs with Coles and Woolworths so that they're actively participating as well. And so it's that two-pronged thing of you need to give workers the ability to bring forward their issues and speak in trusted circles with people from their community who speak their language and understand, but also having the pressure on employers to not go with the practices of, sign this document, bad luck, you signed a contract for this bus for 12 months, even though it's way too expensive and not at cost and does not meet the requirements, but you signed it. And so you need the retailers and others involved as well, so that there is some accountability circle that allows workers to talk and has someone who can come in and actually enforce the rights that they have.
And we did hear yesterday directly from some people who have experienced this, who are in the room again today, and sort of giving their experiences around, what that looks like on a practical day-to-day level. And what Poonam referred to was also this sort of building of trust, which is, again, what you're saying is that you can't just move in and pluck someone and say, hey, we're the union, trust us, we'll do everything for you. It's an investment by a union, it's investment by a company to build things really slowly. And the reality of, the global world and economy we live in, that there's often not that luxury of time built into the process. So the idea of meaningful worker engagement in due diligence means that we have to step back and slow down and actually listen to people on the ground, find the right people who can speak up, but giving them the confidence to do so takes time. And that's a lot of the time, that we don't have and that doesn't happen. So, Robyn, we've heard a little bit about some particular vulnerabilities of certain groups, and your organisation, IOM, in particular works with migrant workers. And we're going to hear in the next session from the excellent Laurie Berg about some of those issues in Australia. But IOM, works globally. So what sort of work do you do to empower and sort of bring to the fore, particularly migrant workers in this space?
Yeah, well, just stemming on the last two speakers, I really want to emphasise that migrant workers are 3 times more likely to be victims of forced labour than non-migrant workers. And really, I think what I'm going to talk about today is
can you hold it a little bit closer?
A little bit closer, sorry. Applies to national supply chains here in Australia, so the PALM scheme, workers coming out on the PALM scheme, but also global supply chains as well. And starting from that beginning of that trust factor, one of the first risks that migrant workers face is they're often succumb to unethical recruitment practices, and they're charged recruitment fees. So there's the beginning of a distrust and the fear of how they're going to pay that recruitment fee if they do not hold on to the job. They need to be able to hold on to the job, so therefore they may be compelled to be silent and not raise grievances during their point of employment. Building that trust and understanding, one of the critical things that needs to be implemented is pre-departure orientation, so that workers have a thorough understanding of their rights and how to lodge grievance mechanisms. And it may not be through the company they're working with, it may be externally too, how they could access the Fair Work Ombudsman. But this needs to be done in a language and a context that they understand as well. So that's extremely important that this is done pre-departure, but also post-arrival as well. So once the work commences, and it is the employer's responsibility to implement that orientation, so that ensuring that the workers have an understanding of how they can lodge a complaint, how they can access remedy as well.
Great. So, Hannah, you've heard a bit about how this works sort of on a personal level and how it works on the ground. Part of your work is particularly looking at tech-enabled solutions or, proposals to address issues around this. And often we hear about sort of tech-enabled worker voice. Do you see this as something that's a substitute for worker organisation, a complement to it, a catalyst? And also, how do you deal with some of the challenges around that, particularly around privacy?
Good question. So first of all, it is not a substitute for worker organisations. In many cases, we work with worker organisations to help them to understand the conditions that are faced by the members of their organisation. So if you have a disparate organisation with people who are hard to reach, like it's hard for a labour inspector to get there, like it's hard for a police officer to understand the conditions of work, sometimes it's also hard for a worker organisation. So this tools like a prize that we use, it can help to overcome some of the problems that Robyn was talking about, so the different languages. Yesterday we heard about people saying, what does exploitation look like? And right now the burden is on the worker to say, yes, I'm in an exploitative condition. So we provide tools to those frontline responders to overcome problems with communication, privacy, so that they can help to address, to identify that there's a problem, and then to triage and go further to say what should happen next. You asked about privacy. I can't say what everyone does, but for us, we were really actually inspired by, again, IOM. They have a really good data protection manual, and we looked at that and really considered it at the beginning when we were thinking, what data do we want to capture, and what is the risk if we capture data? So we made sure that nothing was personally identifiable for us. There is a point where you can turn on a thing. If you are going to have it, use our tools as a grievance mechanism, you can turn on the part where a worker can choose to leave their phone number if they want to be contacted, but then it's up to them to leave it. And then as a brand or an organisation who we work with, we tell them, don't turn it on unless you're going to do something, because there's nothing worse than capturing this and having that expectation of follow-up if you're not going to follow up.
And then can I just ask you a follow-up, because we've talked about trust in relation to workers raising grievances. How then do you build trust using a sort of a tech-enabled solution? And have you ever been involved or seen instances where the sort of the technology has been co-designed or co-implemented with workers?
Yeah, so Apprise started as a tool that I developed at United Nations University, and we based our work in Thailand because I was in Macau and it was close. And there we co-designed the tool with workers. So we did we had funding from Humanity United and Freedom Fund to work with frontline responders. So NGOs, Raktai, Stella Maris, LPN, as well as IOM, as well as IJM, all of these other people who I've seen in the audience here, to understand what problems did people have, what technology did they have access to, and how did they think technology could help them to solve their problems. So also because we had that luxury of time as a research project compared to in the private sector. We were able to do like every 6 weeks go and work with the NGOs in their outreach to say, how are workers seeing this tool? Do they even prefer a face-to-face interview? Because that's a research question, right? We can, as a researcher, say, is this tool even going to be useful? Do people prefer to use it? And overwhelmingly, I was surprised. People said yes, because it's personal things that they're asking. And if I'm asking you if you're exploited on a fishing vessel, for example, it's harder to have that question and look someone in the eyes, to being able to answer, and then I know that you know my responses, and you know if I want help to leave this situation.
Can I just add a little bit onto that? So, and complementary to that as well, the advantages of international organisations is obviously the global geographic presence. So, like IOM are in over 500 locations, and we work closely with stakeholders on the ground as well. So, if there is a need for the face-to-face and to build that trust, and they can have those face-to-face group sessions with a sample group from a factory, and they might feel in a safe space to share their story and share their grievances, and so that can really be implemented through local stakeholders, but also from the same nationality as well.
And I'm going to open it up in just a moment to questions from you, but Poonam, I just wanted to ask you sort of one last, because you made a passing reference at the start to sort of the informal sector as well. So, beyond sort of the IR system, where you've got an active union that's involved, beyond systems like CAF, you can then delve down into a much murkier, harder to deal with issue. Do you have any thoughts around how business can better integrate direct worker engagement in that sort of context? In 1 minute or less.
Yes, can I... Look, that's absolutely not my area of expertise or experience, so probably I don't have much to say on that, aside from trying to get those industries and workplaces regulated.
Yeah. Jonathan, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I'd just say, again, using horticulture as an example, big players who have enterprise agreements with the union, we know if there are workers there who are not currently on a visa or, you know, in horrible conditions. Like, those things come to the fore. But the amount of times workers come to me where they've been working for an employer for 6 months, not on a visa, basically in modern slavery, and nobody knows about this because it's an employer that maybe has 20 people. It is a situation that is the quintessential problem. And I think that employers do have a responsibility to ask those smaller labour hire or smaller companies, why don't you have an enterprise agreement? Why haven't you got a world in which the workers are able to speak up? And I think that that is a really big issue. In the PALM scheme, there are 400 approved employers that the government have approved. That is too many. We don't need 400 employers. We need less employers with a higher standard of HR, payroll, and ethical sourcing.
Thank you. So I'd like to invite people to ask a question, and I'll take a couple at a time. Let's start with Marta.
Thank you. My question's for Hannah. So a few years ago, or actually fairly recently, blockchain was touted as this, I suppose, thing of technology that was going to help with transparency supply chains and perhaps enable more worker voice. And obviously, more recently, AI is this thing that we now look at as this shiny thing. And do you see any application of AI in trying to, I suppose, develop technology that might facilitate worker engagement? Like, for instance, I know that some unions have rolled out chatbots in a way, but I don't know the extent to which that was AI enabled. And my university of Sydney, has now recently rolled out a chatbot which is AI based, which focuses on student well-being. So is there any, I suppose, capacity for AI in that space?
Great. We'll take two more. There was one up the front, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
It was just, it's coming. Could just be louder. Thanks. It was just around, there are many digital systems and digital solutions out there, and speaking to many different companies, each one's are picking them up. They might have different suppliers. Those suppliers are using different tools, and each company's having different agreement mechanisms. So how do we make sure there's not just a chaos of data collection, and that when we're doing that, we're not also raising expectations that things will be dealt with that then aren't? So just wondering about that. How do companies navigate that? But also, more importantly, how do workers navigate that? How do they know where they go to, which app they use, and who to speak to, whether onshore or abroad?
Right. If you just pass it to in front of you, then we'll take that last one.
Sure. I guess this is more of a comment, but as what we know about workers and their use of these platforms is if there is no remedy, if there is a risk of deportation, then there is no benefit of using these platforms, and there seems to be little incentive right now in case law, et cetera, to demonstrate that that's an outcome. One of the good practices I've seen is actually treating workers respecting their time involved with some of these processes. And one platform I know actually pays workers to be involved in forums and collecting worker voice. So I think that's just a comment I'd like to make, that it's not just one way. I think businesses need to respect the time that workers know.
So I'll come back to you in 1 sec. Oh, does it directly follow on from this? Okay, so. Sorry, we'll just take one more because it was related. It's also good for the panel to try and remember all the questions. That's not my job.
Mine does connect to kind of the resourcing and the agency. It's mostly, I guess, a question for Jonathan, but this might want to comment, is I guess the gold standard is to have a union, because then you not only get a remedy, you actually get power to change things going forward. And the workers, I imagine, Jonathan, that you're working with are some of the most marginalised that have the least capacity to pay. It seems like a lot of these systems are designed to fail in terms of exploitation, and there's a really strong incentive to keep them moving because you make profit, frankly, if you're more exploitative. How do we set up a system so that unions don't have to, so that, like unions, if that is the gold standard, actually get resourcing to actually, to work within things like the PALM system or other countries? Because I'm imagining resourcing is a really big challenge for you.
Great. For a moment there, I thought she was going to ask how we get away with getting rid of you. But because if you do such a good job, we don't need you. So we'll give everybody a chance to have some input. But basically, there were questions around the role of blockchain and, is it the sort of the saviour of things? What happens when we've got too many of these things and there's this chaotic collection of data? And who's reading all this data? Who's actually looking at it? And then the role of unions. So, Hannah, why don't we start with you and everybody can have input?
Okay, so I'll start with blockchain/AI. For AI, I actually do know of a group who have been using AI, and Sophia, previously from ILO, has integrated an AI chatbot, ChatGPT, into the Recruitment Advisor platform. So that was from ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation. They had this website to provide information for workers going from one place to another place. It was very static previously. I did a review of it. It was very static and hard to understand as somebody who understands already the space, how things were connected. And Sophia told me that they've more recently hooked up ChatGPT to provide a conversational way of getting to that same information. So yes, I think that's really good because it's that same base of knowledge that you've just fed in to be able to answer questions. Previously, you had to know the right question to be able to get to the right answer. But now with ChatGPT, it can look at the syntax and semantic analysis to then find that response. Okay, that was one. Then we had questions about many tools and how do workers know what to do and who to answer. The brands that we work with, they have posters that they send to suppliers, and it explains the details of how to take part, what is the point of having your voice heard, and what should happen afterwards. I'm sure many other tools out there have the same kind of thing, and yes, everybody is collecting different information. We standardize our question sets to the ILO indicators of forced labour just to try and help to have some baseline to assess working conditions, and then we try and use the ILO hard to see, harder to count methodology for estimating child labour and forced labour to estimate the severity of the situation at the end. So that's the frameworks that we use, but again, that's just our tool. Then there was a question about, or more of a comment, that people should, if you give your feedback, things should happen. And you'd heard of, I guess, Blue Number, who have extrinsic motivation, so they pay people for their time. We looked at extrinsic motivation and we'd really tried to figure out a way of giving some kind of a reward to people for participating. Because our study again started as a research project, we had that on the ground time where we went to talk to workers. We started off by giving IDs to them, saying that this is just so we can figure out not to de-anonymize your anonymous responses, but to be able to track so we could look at reward. And people told us that if you give me a different code to other people, I'm worried about your intentions. These people have been facing exploitative situations, which is a betrayal of trust. So I tried to veer away from anything that could look like I was trying to de-anonymize anonymous information. I really like the idea of providing some kind of reward. And for me, the biggest thing that we can do is make sure that people act on any report that's made. So again, in that cyclic evaluation that we've done, we always go with brands and say, act on the easiest thing first. Just make some change. If it's something about there's not enough soap and doors or whatever it is in the toilets, do that first, because then people will see the change and then they'll know that they can trust the system, because the system is bringing change, and then maybe they'll tell you about more exploitative situations that they have faced.
Microwaves in the lunchroom is one of
Nespresso pods.
Just let Jonathan, I'll come to you one sec.
So a good question. Resourcing is a real problem for us. The AWU was born on the back of the shearers in 1896, and we've got a moral imperative to make sure the horticulture industry goes from where it was 10 years ago to an industry that is an ethical supply chain in this country. One of the things I bang on about all the time is this is meant to be tripartite. I'm not the union. The union is your workers. The union is the workers in your supply chain. But in terms of what we all have access to, the employers know who all the workers are. In the PALM scheme, the government know who all the workers are. But I have to spend all my resources trying to find them and to build trust. And I think that is a symptom of the fact that for decades, unions have gone from the legislated necessary part of our IR system to this big bad bogey who's coming to destroy your capitalist enterprise. That's not my role. My role is to help workers have their voice heard. And I have so many fights with people about, I can't tell you who these workers are because of their privacy. These workers need help. We're not sitting in this la-la land where everything's okay. These workers need help, and every single person working in these industries could help just by encouraging workers to join their union. Every day, did you join your union? Are you actively involved in your union? Have you called your union organiser? So to the crux of your point, yes, resourcing is a really big problem, but one of the things that could change in horticulture is multi-employer bargaining. Saying to your berry supplier, are you part of the AWU multi-employer berry bargain? Because if you are, great, and if you're not, all it takes is you signing a document. There's not some big scary process, it's just you agree to be part of the enterprise agreement, and that invites the union in, and it gives people more access to workers. And that is a massive change this federal government have made, and it's a potential. It's not something that we're doing currently, but we are working with employers to get to the point where there is that additional step. It doesn't have to be enterprise by enterprise. Any enterprise can come into that bargain and give their workers the ability to be protected by the conditions of that enterprise agreement.
We'll go to some more questions and stuff.
Thanks. This is for Jonathan, and thanks for sharing the need for cultural framework. We've been banging on about this for the last, 13 years since inception of the program. I'm an Australian South Sea Islander. The Australian Workers, you're just sharing the history, Australian Workers Union were actually instrumental in the deportation under a White Australia policy of some 7,000 of my people back to Vanuatu. Today I'm a Vanuatu citizen, so I'm speaking on behalf of, but also thanking you. But how are you working in with, I guess I've got two questions. How are you working in with you're talking about cultural framework, language, understanding, recruiting of people that can look like us, yeah? Specifically, culturally, Vanuatu are the largest cohort providing seasonal work here in Australia out of the 39,000 of Pacific Islanders and Timor-Leste. How are you working in with the heads of mission in particular, yeah, in Canberra, who are responsible for their nationals? And also, in terms of our Vanuatu workers and others paying these fees to the Australian Workers Union, they are Vanuatu nationals. So how does that work when they're not a resident in terms of the legal support that they can acquire through state agencies, government agencies, etc.?
For sure.
So I'll let you answer that, and I'll just warn the panel that we're almost finished, but I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to give one takeaway that you'd like people to think about following this session.
I'll start by saying it is a reckoning that my union has gone through about what our history is and what our role was 100 years ago and who we represented, and it is something that I take extremely seriously, that my generation and the generation of unionists today have a responsibility to make sure every worker in this country, whether they be Australian citizens, temporary migrant, skilled, permanent, etc., we have a responsibility to make sure all their voices are heard. In terms of working with the head of mission, so the PALM scheme has a complicated governance structure that DUA have built, and they often try to keep us all separate. Unions over here, heads of mission over there, employers over there, and we are all working collaboratively. I meet with heads of mission, with CLOs from different countries, as well as the Approved Employers Association and DUA almost every day. Like, it is insane how much we do. And part of that is making sure that the different views that the head of mission from Vanuatu and Fiji, etc., are all brought to the front. And the point of all of that is all of them are appalled every time that the same thing happens. A worker is charged $160 a week to live in a house with 10 other people. The house is 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen. It's not market rate. There is someone profiteering despite the fact the system is not meant to allow people to do that. And to your point about they're not Australian citizens, they work in Australia, they have the right to be represented by their union. And I just talk about exactly what it is that we do, right? Whether it is trying to help workers empowered to use the rules of the guidelines in PALM to request receipts for their accommodation, for their transport, actually using the mechanisms that exist there, but most importantly, finding that team leader who I can talk to and explain the rights, and then they can go and tell that story and educate and bring people along. Whether it's superannuation, probably the biggest issue that PALM workers bring to me is when I go home, how do I get my super? Because to them, it's not a retirement fund, it is the earnings that they got while working here temporarily. And they don't have an equivalent super fund in a lot of countries that can be trusted to give them the money at their retirement age. That's a big issue that we are campaigning on. But I would say that the biggest thing that we've done for PALM workers and in the industry generally is we got rid of piece rates, which means every single worker in this country in horticulture has to be paid the minimum wage. It is an outrage that that wasn't the case 2 years ago. And we have worked extremely hard to reform the system so that every single PALM worker here has to be paid for 30 hours, or has to be offered 30 hours of work every week, averaged over 4 weeks, currently changing to every week from the 1st of July. And that means that we don't see any more people sitting at home, accruing debt, and effectively going into slavery conditions, which is what the original PALM scheme settings allowed for, and I would say encouraged. And so that has changed, and that is why these workers need to be introduced to their union, given the opportunity to speak, and given the opportunity to actually make settings that will make the PALM scheme sustainable going forward.
Thank you, Jonathan. So very quickly, Hannah, starting with you, what's the one thing you would like people to think about after this session?
I would like people to think that worker voice tools are incredible to be able to reach more people in different languages and overcome issues with privacy, but they have to be embedded in a framework where there is that follow-up and there is responsible use of the data as well. So they're not a silver bullet, but they can help.
Thanks. Poonam?
I'm going to build on what James said earlier this morning, which is prevention is better than cure. So more of a focus on putting in place decent work conditions when you're thinking about any of these sorts of efforts, so that we're really stopping things from deteriorating to a state at which it becomes a complex issue, I'll say, to discuss.
Yeah, I think asking that question, have people met their union? Are they engaged in their union? Why aren't they in their union? Is important, and that's a question we should all be asking up and down the supply chain.
And stemming from that, in Australia, workers have the opportunity to join unions. Unfortunately, that's not the case in all global supply chains. So we advocate for that human right, that workers' right to be able to join unions is one thing. And through the due diligence process, it's imperative that there's migrant worker representation within the corrective action plan as an outcome of grievance mechanisms.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, what we're trying to get at, and I think what they've conveyed very clearly, is to think about what's effective. When we talk about due diligence, then we say it's got to actually be effective to have any meaning. And a very simple way of thinking about effective is that we're doing something better today than we did yesterday. So it might be small steps, it might be big steps, but you've got to be moving forward. And you've got to ask yourself, whether you're in a company or elsewhere, what are we planning on? What are we doing today that we didn't think about or we didn't do yesterday to show that we are going in that direction? So thank you very much for all of those wonderful contributions. Thank you to me for finishing so diligently on time. My dad was in the army, and the one virtue I have in life is being punctual. That's about it. So handing back to Fiona. Thank you.